looking forward to talking to you because I know you covered Fuck Up Nights in Toronto. I have actually went to one of their events. Yeah. It was many years ago when I lived in Toronto, but it was like really awesome. So yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to hearing how that experience went. But of course,
I actually just one caveat. I wasn't able to go to one live. I was only able to see because of the pandemic a few videos.
Right. Yes, I know. Unfortunately, yeah, through COVID, they had to do a lot of stuff virtual. But I still feel like they're able to share their kind of mission, which is pretty cool. So yeah, before we dive into all of that, Shamsiya, of course, our wonderful co-host here is going to give her awesome introduction for you, and then we'll hop into the questions. All right, let's do it.
All right, look for me.
Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to Failure Decoded. Today is a very special episode, and I'm so happy we're recording this. I will tell you later on why this is special. First, let me invite the guest, David Silerberg. He's a journalist, editor, writing coach, event producer, spoken word poet, and theater artist. You can find his work all over the internet, and he has written to some mainstream publications like BBC News, Washington Post, Toronto Star, The Globe and Mail, Fast Company, MIT Technology, and so on. And the writing is so clear and concise and succinct, but it's so easy to read and understand. Perhaps why I love reading his book. I love reading his articles, and I read one and then I just kept reading more. Well, that's what happens. Beyond the written work, David's artistry extends to the stage, where he has graced audiences with his evocative spoken word poetry and mesmerizing theatrical performances, which I also happened to watch snippets of last night. He is also the former artistic director of Toronto Poetry Slam, a competitive poetry series that takes place at the Drake Hotel. And he has enthralled audiences across Canada, New York, London, and Paris. The enthralling Unique made its debut in 2018, and more recently, Before and After, in 2023 at the esteemed Transac. Recently, his very renowned article, I feel, The Entrepreneurs Celebrating Their Past Failures, was written for BBC News, which caught my attention. And why? Because a year back, Rachel and I started this podcast, Failure Decoded. We were on a mission to decode failure and bring to the people everything that failure in startups is all about. Our objective was to create data points, to build a community, to normalize talking about failure so that entrepreneurs are less scared and actually go in with their ideas instead of procrastinating or going down rabbit hole of research. And when you read an article like this suddenly on BBC News, you're like, okay, someone's thinking like us. It's almost like they're validating our thought process, which is huge, especially if you're a podcaster or you're writing, you're a freelance writer. You need that validation means a lot. And that's what happened. But he's not an entrepreneur. So I was like, why is this article so relatable? What is the thought process? What got him to write this? And what is the process? How did you approach it? It was so intriguing because I felt talking to him might just make my craft a little more better, a little more relatable to the audience. So that's why I feel this episode is very special to me. I'm going to learn a lot, and I'm hoping and manifesting there's going to be a part 2 with David. So welcome to the show, David.
Thank you for having me on. It's an honor to be on Failure Decoded. I look forward to talking to you about the topic and much more.
Awesome.
And I couldn't do justice to your introduction at all because you are so multifaceted. So I will leave it up to you to introduce yourself a little more.
Okay, sure. Yeah, you did a great job in summing up, so I won't repeat a lot of things you said, but essentially, I knew I wanted to be a writer when I was 16. I was writing fantasy books and short stories for friends. And when it came time to decide what I wanted to do for a living, I decided on journalism because I've always been curious about people. And the really cool thing about journalism I learned, especially when I was at TMU, was that Monday's not like Tuesday. Wednesday's not like Thursday. Every day is different as a journalist. And I knew that would fit with my personality. I'm not the kind of person who enjoys doing the same thing every day. Even if monotony can be a great, platform for daydreaming as a creative writer. I just knew I wanted to do maybe an article on neuroscience on Monday, an article on arts management on Tuesday, and then something different on Wednesday, like talking to entrepreneurs who spoke about failure. And so that's always kind of been a through line, I guess, in my life as someone who works in poetry and spoken word as well. where every poem can be touching on a different important topic relating to family, relationships, nature, politics, social justice, bullying. And those are some of the topics I've covered as a poet as well. And that's kept my interest as a writer so that I'm not staying kind of static or doing the same thing I did in 2022 that I'm doing in 2023. So professional development has always kind of been crucial to me. And that's also why one thing I'll add to the bio is that I'm a writing coach. And that's what I wanted to do during the pandemic was, I loved going into schools, doing workshops and spoken word poetry, but I saw a gap in journalists needing coaches as well, especially freelancers that were becoming a lot more common, unfortunately, due to firings and media outlets and complete even disappearances of media outlets that shut down for good, whether due to the pandemic or falling ad revenue. So becoming a writer coach was really fulfilling for me in the past 2 years and has kind of fed that kind of part of me, that's that through line of doing something different in 2022, 2023 than I have done in the past 2 years. Same thing with pitching to different outlets. I always want to strive to write for a news network that I've always respected, but I've never written for, whether that's Fast Company or MIT Tech Review in 2022, two outlets that I've really admired from afar and read their articles and kind of been jealous of writers who got, their bylines in those outlets. But I knew I had, ideas for both Fast Company, which covers technology, and MIT Technology Review, which also covers digital culture. And I finally, after a few failed pitches, got into those publications. So I can speak on that later if you like. And yeah, that's basically a nice sum up, I think, of an add-on on what you already shared.
Awesome. It's interesting because I feel like there actually are a lot of parallels with entrepreneurship and journalism, just even based on what you said. Mm-hmm. Just the fact that you have to pitch constantly, like that's something entrepreneurs have to do. The fact that Monday is different than Tuesday is different than Wednesday, an uncertain path is like literally what entrepreneurship is. So thriving in ambiguity, even just like making sense of I'm assuming you have to go out there and find all these facts and information, and distill it and put it together and package it so it is, as Shamsiya said, relatable to the reader, understandable to the reader. So, although you're I'm not really an entrepreneur, I'm well, in a way, you have a lot of those skills that are needed for sure.
Right. Yeah. I think anyone who works in the freelance space is an entrepreneur. I think that's why that definition can be pretty elastic these days. It's fluid. That it's not just saying, I'm starting a company that's, incorporated and selling X, Y, and Z to people. In one way, I'm selling myself to editors, saying, take a chance on me. Here's my past clips to prove that I'm bona fides and that I can do what I set out to do. And it's vulnerable, really, to put yourself out there like that. And it's vulnerable to face rejection from editors who don't maybe see the value in your pitch or in your writing at that moment. And at first, that can hurt the ego. That can make you feel like you're not worthy of being part of this field or this space. But I've always believed that journalists have to develop thick skin, whether they're freelancers pitching to editors or trying to get interviews that end up going nowhere or being rejected outright, or getting your first draft back with a lot of red pen on it and realizing that you needed, to focus a bit more clearly on transitional statements or the lead or the ending or buttressing facts with enough research. And that is something that doesn't always come naturally right away. Journalism school at TMU, I was hurt sometimes when I saw all those red marks, thinking maybe I'm not a great writer if I'm getting edited so heavily. But a few professors told me, no, that's part of the process of being a journalist, is seeing those errors you make, even in sentence structure or in grammar, realizing it's only going to make you a better writer down the road. The more you apply your trade, and the more you put your bum into the seat and actually write, because I think a lot of writers want to have written, they want to have their book on the shelf, and don't want to also go through that arduous process of writing every day, of putting pen to paper, even when you don't feel like it at all, even when the muse doesn't strike or doesn't grace you with her presence. You have to write every day, and that's something that I also learned at J School.
Yeah. Do you have any tips for how people can do that? Because I think once again, that's also very relatable to entrepreneurship. There's a lot of times where things are not working and it seems like this is going nowhere and maybe I'm not good at this, maybe I'm not cut out for this, but entrepreneur after entrepreneur has told us no, you just got to keep doing it, believe in yourself, just go back day after day. But that is very hard for people to do. It doesn't necessarily come naturally. So what do you do to kind of get through those really tough days where you feel like it's just not working out?
Well, one kind of pre-research thing that I did was I learned about what other journalists dealt with via books they wrote. So I read a lot of books about nonfiction writing and about the roadblocks they faced and the rejection they faced. And that made me feel less alone. And I think that's something that shouldn't be discounted, even if it does sound like, okay, well, that's, just reading a book. How is that going to help? I actually found that really helpful to know that the steps that I was taking as a journalist, maybe full of rejections and failure, was something that a lot of successful journalists face too. I'm always reminded of that story too, of Stephen King, the famous horror novelist, who became an author in his 40s. His first book got accepted when he was 40. Throughout his 30s, he got rejection after rejection saying, "You're not a great writer, this story isn't scary, this story isn't going to sell." And then, he became the best-selling author across the world. But he faced so much rejection in his 30s that he actually put those rejection letters up on a pinboard to remind himself of people that didn't believe in him. And I didn't do that with the pinboard myself, but more of a mental pinboard of people who kind of didn't believe in me and maybe rejected me at the beginning, saying, a bit of I'll show them. And I continued to pitch to those editors that at first might have rejected me. And once I got a few acceptances from those editors, that was the validation I needed. So it's about stick-to-itiveness. It's about keeping up with your discipline and your habits. It's really easy to slip from a habit of, let's say, pitching every day at 9 a.m. to pitching every other day to only pitching once a week. But if you have that discipline of, setting time aside to come up with ideas, to pitch the ideas, and to find the right editors to send those emails to, that can reinforce some feelings of, okay, I'm on the road. Maybe I'm not going to get an acceptance, but at least I'm putting in the hours and I'm not giving in to despondency or laziness.
So that's the code that you've cracked. Yes, there is going to be rejection, but you have to do the groundwork. Right. You have to get into the garage. You have to put that pen to the paper and lead a disciplined life. Keep doing what you want. Maybe sometimes survival surpasses passion. So I guess.
Yeah, that reminds me of a quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson that I really like. He says, the poet, "The greatest glory in living lies not in never failing, but in rising every time we fall." And there's variations of this quote from other folks, but I always like that succinctness of what he said, because the more we can rise after we fall and learn from our failures, the stronger our backbone will be, the stronger I think our brain will be in learning what worked and what didn't. And this, I think, applies to not just writing and entrepreneurship, but in everything from family life to relationships to personal finance and understanding what works for you in terms of investments as well, and being just maybe better. Like maybe X investment didn't work out so well, maybe Y investment will work out better. Maybe this romantic relationship didn't work out so well. That doesn't mean that's a statement about you and who you are as an attractive personality or physically, but it should inspire you to kind of rise up again, as Emerson said.
Yeah, I love that. And we'd love to dive in now to the fuck up night stuff. So we know you covered a story on that. And so did you have to pitch that story? Is that how that worked? And it was what made you pick it?
Yeah.
What drew you to it?
Yeah, I have a relationship with my editor, Will, at BBC, where he is open to all kinds of pitches relating to business, technology in some way. And I heard about Fuck Up Nights a while ago because I think I follow Marsha Drucker on LinkedIn, who's the manager of the Toronto version of these nights, where, just to quickly sum up, entrepreneurs talk for half an hour or so about a major failure in their life and what they learned from it. They're not allowed to promote what they're currently doing in their job, so it's not like TED Talks where you talk about how great you are and the successes that you have had. It's kind of the reverse TED Talk. It's talking about a real big blunder you made and what you learned from that exact moment. I found that really interesting because I subscribe to TED Talks on YouTube, masterclass.com as well, I've been a part of for a while. And all these talks are inspirational, but I feel like they're missing a key piece of the entrepreneurial puzzle or the leadership puzzle, which is what happens when something doesn't go right. What happens when you make a mistake out of slip of the finger to not thinking ahead about a certain bump in the road to a major failure, like perhaps starting a company that just didn't go anywhere and didn't gain any traction with customers or with venture capitalists. And I love that Fuck Up Nights has spread to dozens of countries around the world, that it's not a North American thing. It actually started in Mexico when Carlos decided to do it. And it spread to, Europe, South America, every city in the US and Canada practically. And that tells me that people maybe have been desensitized to the TED Talk format of here's my, aspiring story, here are my steps to success, here's the cool thing I invented, to here's what I did wrong, and here's what I learned, and that's all. I'm not going to talk about how great my current startup is. And I think that's attractive to a lot of folks. And actually, I was reminded of that recently when I went to Collision, a big tech conference in Toronto that happens every year at the Enercare Center. And my issue with Collision is that it's a glorified kind of podium to talk about how great your company is doing in AR, AI, e-commerce, etc. And I just wish that, Collision and Fuck Up Nights could kind of blend together in some way to create a night or a few talks where failure was the main goal. Failure was the main thread that ran through each talk. Because I think there's a lot to learn about being unsuccessful and trying really hard, but also rising up again.
Wow, that was a TED Talk right there. Seriously, really,
Thank
David.
you.
But honestly, when Rachel and I started Failure Decoded, that was primarily the idea. Like, why don't people talk about failure? There's so much to learn, especially in the current scenario. You're a business reporter primarily, so now there's literally a shift happening, and it's not just hidden; it's coming out. People all across the globe are going through financial crisis. There's economic crisis. Startups are failing, but there's not enough information out there, except for the fact that, they don't have enough money to raise, or they raise a lot of money, the VCs and the money. Okay, that's the only kind of narrative you hear. And you want to know more. Like, why would a startup fail? Why are the similar kind of startups coming up? Why are startups not learning from each other as to, okay, this has failed. Why do I want to do the same thing? What is the reason? I think the lack of information is creating replicas of the same company, the same process, and eventually everything's going to fail. What is your insight? What is your, I want to know your, whatever research you've done, anything you can provide us with.
Yeah, I think in my years covering startup culture in Toronto and beyond, I've seen, one thing that's, relating to your podcast is that failure can be taboo to talk about. And I think that's why nights like Fuck Up Nights are really important to highlight, because it shows how it's okay to talk about that. And I think a few years ago, maybe 10, 20 years ago, it wasn't as an open conversation where you could talk about, as a startup entrepreneur, why certain ideas fizzled, why certain products didn't move, and why even your startup just didn't fail to gain traction. And it's something that I learned personally when I ran a news network called Digital Journal. For 14 years or so. We wanted to be kind of the Wired magazine of Canada, or the Huffington Post kind of Canada. But one thing we learned is that we failed to gain traction with an audience because we were a general news site. And we were trying to be something for everybody. We kind of parted ways with our, earlier 2000s theme of writing about technology and digital culture to write about everything once we became a news website only and ditched the print magazine. And I think that hurt us because we could have really, I think, staked our reputation as being a one-stop shop for news about digital culture in Canada. Only focusing on that. No writing about any other kind of news, no politics, no sports, no arts, and no travel. But because we were a citizen journalism site that allowed people to write from anywhere in the world, I think we were really passionate about people writing about what was important to them. And maybe it wasn't technology. So there was a plus and kind of con with our idea for digitaljournal.com. But what the outcome was not an exit of millions of dollars, was not a swimming in ad revenue. Unfortunately, we were just kind of getting by the best we could because we were a small team, a lean team of maybe 4 people in this news network startup. And so what I learned at Digital Journal that I think other startup cultures can learn too is lean into your gut instinct of what is going to work for your company. And I think we strayed from our gut instinct of sticking with digital technology news to try to be general news because we were worried that we wouldn't be as popular as CNN, as CTV, Global News, etc., The Star. And it was a heady fight to try to go up against these giants, but we thought we could try to make it work because we had this cool technology with our digital news network, and we allowed anyone to write from anywhere in the world. But I think that's the key thing, Shamsiya, that I want to stress that you mentioned about so maybe startup culture looking a bit cookie cutter is it's easy to fall into the trap of I want to be everything for everyone as a startup, try to get as many customers to buy either my widget or read my news articles, to realizing you have to be catering to a niche audience these days because there's not a lot of Apples and Microsofts and Googles in the world, and it's just a hard bet to be one of those giants.
Yeah. I do agree with what you said about niching down. Is I think some people have fear when doing that because but what about all these customers I could lose out on? But at the same time, there's 8 billion people on the planet. I promise you, if you niche down to something, there's many millions of people that probably believe in this or think the way you do or whatever it might be. So I think your pool of potential customers is still very large. And now I know it sounds like you didn't niche down at the time, but in hindsight, looking back, other than gut instinct, was there anything else or any other tips you could provide for how someone might niche down? And were there any signals that you saw that was that's why we should have done that?
I think the main signal that we saw was our readers really took to our digital culture articles. Not so much our travel articles or political articles or op-eds on the arts. And I think because we had that reputation from the magazine days of being a digital culture and tech news source, that should have told us to continue with that theme as opposed to thinking erroneously, oh, we're great at digital news. That must mean we're great at general sports news, arts news, etc. That we can kind of expand our scope. The thing about expanding your scope is that you're not going to be attracted to the folks that were your first few fans. And I think it's important not to, neglect those early adopters that got you where you were. That made you feel like, oh, okay, this can be a legit business. This can be a legit entrepreneurial, venture for me and my colleagues. And I think another signal was also looking at the market. The market was fragmented into a lot of niche publications, whether that was publications that focused solely on fashion, on woodworking, on being a better parent, on being a better dog owner. We saw so many publications that were, just for dog owners, for instance. And they were and are still around, thanks to knowing their audience and knowing their ad audience too will be, dog food kind of companies, etc. But when you're a general news site, who is going to be your advertising partners? It's tough even for them to think about what traction their ads will get or their, sponsored content posts will get if an audience is so widespread that you can't say that, oh, this is a digitally savvy crowd, 18 to 24, etc. So I think that can really bite you quite harshly if you don't have that niche focus. And it doesn't always just come down to gut, but it can come from those kind of signals. And even just looking at something as obvious as Google Analytics. Where are your customers kind of clamoring towards? What sections of the site were the stickiest, meaning they stuck around for a long time, pretty low bounce rate, and they enjoyed reading more than one article in, let's say, technology or digital culture. So that was valuable for us.
Wow, yeah, that's pretty cool, and that's something to keep in mind for sure. So you have a lot of news and you are working in the startup ecosystem. I am really curious to hear some epic failures that have come your way. If you might, don't mind sharing it with us.
Sure. Well, I remember writing, and there's a real big epic failure that you might have heard about 4 years ago. I wrote about it only once because other reporters covered it exhaustively. Do you remember when Google Sidewalk Labs wanted to come to Toronto and bring to our Quayside area, our Portlands area, a smart city?
Yeah.
And they had ideas of having warming tiles that would melt the snow, wooden awnings, internet connected garbage cans that would let you know, the city know when the garbage can is full, they could be refilled quickly. And the big failure there was Google thought, we'll take all of our customer data from Toronto, and they won't care. They won't care that we are the one-stop kind of hub for all their data. But privacy concerns became the real bugaboo that, killed Google Sidewalk Labs and their ambition to bring a smart city to Toronto. Because they didn't think that either grassroots groups or their board members on Waterfront Toronto would be so intently focused on the data that Google would be collecting and not sharing with any level of government, but keeping it for their own kind of purposes. That was alarming. And that showed hubris, I believe, in how Google saw the smart city experiment in Toronto. It showed, I think, a lack of compassion for what people were saying about their data privacy rights, especially those who lived along the lakeshore and were going to be probably affected most by Sidewalk Labs. And I think they underestimated what Waterfront Toronto's anxieties would be around having a tech company act as a real estate company, essentially, and create what they called affordable homes that were no bigger than sometimes 300 square feet, but were very sustainable, very eco-friendly, but were not practical in terms of even more than one person living in there. And that was an epic failure on a really grand scale. So that's well documented. A lot of your listeners probably know about that debacle. But it's worth revisiting, I think, because privacy rights continue to be in the news, whether that's due to Facebook or TikTok or maybe now Threads. And that's not going to go anytime soon. Same with smart cities. Smart cities are continuing to be built, perhaps not in North America, but in Abu Dhabi, all across Europe, some areas of South America, whether Google is involved or not. And I think data privacy will continue to be top of mind for a lot of folks. And the failure for some of these tech companies to realize how important it is for people to feel secure about their data. Even though we are double-clicking on Instagram, even though we are willingly sharing our location on Facebook, there has to be some more assurances when we're out in the public and what Google calls our urban data is being collected is something also top of mind for us. Now, on a smaller scale, I remember talking to an entrepreneur who won't be me, because I didn't really get his permission to share his story, who thought that he was really going to make it in the telecom business in Toronto. He was rising through the ranks of one of our big telecom providers here, wireless providers in Canada. And he felt like this was the path for him, to be in the C-suite. corner office perhaps one day of this telecom provider. But he felt like a failure when he got fired due to cost cutting. And he thought that he did everything right, that he did the steps he needed to take after his MBA to become, a major executive in a telecom business. So he felt really demoralized that he couldn't progress in a role that he felt was natural for him. That was a great fit. He had, impressive numbers in terms of his work ethic and in terms of, the projects that he was quarterbacking. The cost cutting can happen no matter how strong you are as a manager or as an executive. And that's a lesson that he learned pretty quickly when he got fired for what he thought was not due cause. But he didn't stay down. And on that kind of quote of Emerson, he rose back up to create a startup that created devices to help seniors call police or ambulances if they're facing an emergency. Kind of like, the lifeline that you see some maybe seniors wear around their neck. Something similar, but a bit more juiced up with some other kind of bells and whistles. And he felt like, now this is my mission. Sure, I might have felt really down about myself when I got fired, even though I was on, the right track to become a successful executive or C-suite leader. But he didn't let that failure get him down too deeply. Instead, he realized, well, maybe I can do something on my own. I don't need a major company to give me that buoyancy to become the leader that I can be. I can start my own company. As far as I know, I've been just, keeping track a little bit of what he's up to. He's doing really well. Some new iterations of that device for seniors. Some retirement homes have enlisted his services to provide their seniors with those devices in Ontario. So it sounds like, for him at least, that failure turned into a path for success.
Yeah. I think some people have that ability to almost turn adversity or rejection into fuel that fires them and gets them onto the next thing. So it sounds like he has that within him. So that's great that he's doing well. Because I agree. When you kind of train your whole life to do something and you're really focused on it and passionate about it, it doesn't work out, that is such a huge blow to someone. So the fact that you can pick yourself up and keep going is just a great personality trait to have, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Even if you do something that's not going to bring in the kind of financial security that you had before, I think that was a concern for him.
Definitely.
And probably a concern for a lot of entrepreneurs who came from maybe mainstream jobs into their own ventures. That is very under-recognized as an anxiety, especially if you have a family to support of, I want to fulfill my dream, but I also got to feed my kids and pay the mortgage.
Toronto has been very conducive and very supportive of startups and entrepreneurs. There are lots of funds and grants available. It's really amazing, the networking events that happen here. But in general, when you go online and look at Toronto startup ecosystem, I do not get enough information comparing it to the startup capital of the world, which is the United States. So I wanted to ask you, as a journalist and as a business reporter primarily, where does Toronto stand today when it comes to the startup energy? I know a lot of tech people do a little bit of startup here, but then they move their businesses to the United States, Texas and California and all of that. So what's the scene there?
Well, what I've kind of noticed is similar to what you kind of just mentioned, which is entrepreneurs begin a startup in Toronto because they have a strong network of maybe software engineers and marketing folks that they can kind of enlist to give their startup that, first year success or get their name known to local media. But there comes a point in, I think, a lot of Toronto startups, life cycle where they have to take the next step. And that next step is often going to the home of immense venture capital, media attention, and an inspirational ecosystem of Silicon Valley. And until Silicon Valley, collapses, which I don't think it ever will, it will continue, I think, to attract people from not just Toronto, but from Vancouver, Montreal, Ottawa, Calgary, who want to level up where their startup is right now. Because I think what I've noticed is you reach a certain shelf of success when you're in Canada, where you've done everything that you can. You've maybe attracted the most amount of customers. You've maybe been on Dragon's Den. You've maybe been on the cover of Global Mail or Canadian Business. But if you really want to gain more traction with global customers, especially if you are a company that doesn't have to be focused in Canada due to being a remote first company, for instance, then heading to Silicon Valley is the route that a lot of startups go. And I don't blame them. I know it can be tough to attract, let's say, venture capital or global media attention in Toronto, and that you reach a certain peak here that levels off after a few years. But to counter that argument, we've seen companies like Shopify continue to operate out of Ottawa and be very happy with their Ottawa headquarters. It might have, yes, satellite offices in New York and California, but have remained a Canadian company. We see that with, FreshBooks, the invoicing software company that has remained a Toronto kind of stalwart for maybe a dozen years. I've always seen FreshBooks kind of keep up with their venture capital rounds in Canada, continue to gain a lot of Canadian customers and clients, but are used by Americans as well for invoicing in a way that levels up what they're doing out on Word docs or PDFs. So there are ways, I think, for Canadian startups to remain in Canada, but I think what I've noticed in my business reporting is the majority feel like it's time to move on at this point.
Yeah.
Well,
this is a bit of a segue, and I apologize. And I know we're coming up on time, so I feel like maybe we can make this your last question. But I feel like your kind of solo entrepreneurship in terms of like your course business and kind of consulting could be of interest to people, because I think, let's say you're right, maybe you don't want to like run this huge tech company. And a lot of times when you talk about startups, that's what everyone thinks, like, oh, tech and VCs and I got to raise all this money. And it's like, well, that's not necessarily true. Like, you as a person probably has tons of skills that you can monetize by going out into the free market and either, like a course business, workshops, consulting, freelancing, and through your journalism career, it seems like you've had a lot of those experiences. So how did you break into that? Like, what was your kind of thought process behind saying, you know what, I'm gonna start this course business?
I think I realized that, it fed a certain part of me. It was fulfilling for me to help others reach their goals. Because when I was going into schools, and this is more on the poetry side, but I was going to schools, elementary, high school, middle schools, to teach kids about poetry, and I saw, the light in their eyes when they realized that poetry wasn't just this dusty old topic that was just Shakespeare and Robert Frost, but could be, from folks that were their age or have experiences that mirrored their own. It was inspiring to me. It gave me a sense of purpose as well. And so when I began my coursework in helping freelance journalists, and also I've also worked with some agencies in how to attract media attention for their clients, something that I've always enjoyed doing as well. I've led a few online seminars on how startups can attract media attention as a journalist point of view. I kind of understand why people become teachers full time, because there's really something enriching about seeing someone grow from, this is cliche, from a seedling to a flower, or really understand more about the business that they're in thanks to your tutelage or thanks to your mentorship. And I think when you are solo, so often as a writer and as an entrepreneur, you need that interaction with other people to feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself. Because it can get lonely. Just even on a straight up basis, it can get lonely being a writer without colleagues that you see every day. Sure, you might see people at your work sharing space or online, but it's not the same as being in a bustling newsroom, for instance. And that loneliness can be kind of eased a bit by teaching others the lessons that you learn as an entrepreneur, as a creative, or even as a writer, And to see them progress over that 8-week course, for instance, from someone who wanted to write to someone who is writing to someone who is getting published, that's an important part of why I do what I do. And I kind of wish I had that when I was younger. I didn't really have a mentor when I was younger, or a coach. I didn't seek one out, so that's also on me. I think people have to look for it. It's not going to always come to you. And that's something I wish I had. So I'm happy to give that to other folks who might need it as well, because it's an important part of my own personal growth.
Wow. I just have to say something here. So are you working alone, or have you built a team for your writing?
I work alone. I do outsource some things like transcribing notes to other folks, but no, it's basically a solo venture for everything I do, whether that's journalism, my poetry or solo work, or coaching other writers.
I feel that there need to be more coaches out there teaching people how to write, because honestly, as a reader, I feel like the content out there is getting really bad, really bad. It's like, even like, and it's kind of, I don't know if it was in goodwill, you didn't mention it, but that should like primarily be your objective. Improve the content out there. So, the art of writing and reading.
There is a lot of content out there. That's very true. But I just got an email from someone who's writing a book, and he wants some help on his book before he submits it to his publisher. And that's an example too of helping a writer who I never really expected to help a book author this quarter, this month. Wasn't really on my radar, but he emailed me, needs some help, and that's going to be again Monday not being like Tuesday. I'm going to do something different with him than I have with my other clients in the courseware business who were maybe freelance journalists, pitching to the Times, pitching to the Washington Post. It's very different than a book author who needs, copy edits on his maybe 30,000 word manuscript.
Wow. Yeah. So is it like just friendly help, or is it more like a business transaction?
Oh no, this is going to be a business transaction. Yeah, because I'm past the days of working for free, which is also an important lesson for entrepreneurs and writers. Is there comes a moment when you have to stop writing for exposure or credit, because exposure is not going to buy you groceries, but it is maybe a great way to start out if you're in high school, university, and you want to get your name out there. Write for free, sure, when you don't maybe have the demands of expenses, but then you have to graduate to a certain amount per word that feels right for you.
Perfect. Yeah, I just have one last question. It won't take a lot of time. Yeah. So,
no problem.
There are a lot of networking events out there, and us as well. We talk about failure. I want your opinion as to how can we get better, or are we really good? Are we doing a good job? Or is there something we can change here and there, or other networking events to bring the message out a little more clearly, or to fill the gaps a little more impactfully?
Yeah, I think networking events in person are important because, I think also networking events online feel a bit tiring right now for people who aren't zoomed out and want to see people in person. So I think what can maybe be done differently is to blend together different kind of sectors, because I sometimes see too many people in networking events just go into their own kind of niche event without maybe venturing outside of that. Meaning, if it's a fintech event, financial technology, it's just going to be fintech people and fintech bros, let's be honest. But if you venture maybe into healthcare tech, and maybe what can maybe a fintech person learn from a healthcare technology startup or entrepreneur, that sure is not in their sector, but there's lessons to be learned in healthcare that I think can likely apply to finance. That I think can be enriching. Same thing with geography. If you're only meeting folks in downtown Toronto, you're not getting a sense of the entrepreneurial spirit in Scarborough, Saga, Brampton, Richmond Hill, and Vaughan. And I think sometimes we fall into the silos geographically too of who we're going to be inspired by, who we network with. But there is a thriving kind of, let's say, internet culture in Calgary that Toronto can learn from. And so if there's a way to, let's say, even bridge Toronto and Calgary together in a way that we can learn from each other's own successes and failures and what works and what doesn't, then I think that'll be a good next step forward.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, David. Before we jump, do you want to just tell people where they can find you? What's the best place? Like Twitter?
For sure.
LinkedIn?
Yeah, probably my website is the best. I have URL, davidsilerberg.ca, B-E-R-G at the end. It has information about my writing coaching business, where I've been published recently, my solo shows, and how to contact me as well. I'm on Twitter at Silverberg Dave, which is awkward, I know, but David Silverberg was taken. So Silverberg Dave. And I'm on Instagram as David Silverberg. So feel free to find me those places. I'm on Threads too, I guess, as David Silverberg, because it just takes your Instagram handle and forces it to Threads. So feel free to find me in any of those places. I'm on LinkedIn too as David Silverberg.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This is awesome.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I had a really good discussion. It was a nice way to start the morning, I gotta say. It gives me I don't know, energy to tackle the day.
Awesome.
Endorphin rush.
Yeah, hopefully you too as well.
Yeah, it actually feels